Okay. Let me have you focus here on the board for just a second. The word encryption, we went over the email lab on encryption, if you remember. This is just a recap, really, of what happened there. And I'm going to cover a few slides here in Chapter 12. Talk about mainly private and public keys. That's what encryption is all about. The algorithm used and the security used is kind of icing on the cake for encryption. But the main thing that drives encryption is private and public keys. When you have encryption anything, you have somebody create a private key on the end that's being the source of that encrypted whatever, file, email. Then they send, from this private key, multiple public keys are created. Okay? Without a private key, public keys don't exist. And the public keys allow the users that are being sent a document or an email to open up that file or email. Okay? Before that happens, though, they have to set up a trust like we did in that email lab. Remember? I had you guys send each other a public key of that private key that was created. Then you clicked on that key and you, I believe, did an ultimate trust for that user. Now, it can be separate levels of trust. It doesn't have to be ultimate. It can be different levels of trust. But we'll say, we set up some type of trust with that public key. And you can think of a trust as security levels. Okay? An example would be this. If you are a general in the armed forces, you're going to have different security clearance than a private in an armed force, right? And so same thing here. You have different access to different items, different files, different emails possibly, depending upon the public key that you're given. Okay? And then once that trust is set up, you also have what's called in encryption a time span of how long that key is to last. In the lab, I don't know if you remember when we went through that process of creating the keys, you had a time frame you could set to where it could be an hour and that key dies that you're creating, or it could be endless. It lives forever. It can be an hour, a week, a month, a year, whatever the case may be, and then that key dies. Communication within encryption, once a private key is created and a whole bunch of public keys are created and the multiple trusts, then open communication begins. This is a piece at the end like we did at the lab. Once you get that trust set up on any encryption, then you no longer have to do it again. Once the keys have been created, and we'll say, for discussion's sake, the public keys are for maybe 5 years, that trust is now going to be set up with those keys for a 5-year period. So right at the beginning of encryption, one of the things you did when you sent an email was you had a digital certificate it created along with that encrypted key. And the purpose of a digital certificate can be used to associate or bind a user's identity to a public key. And so when you guys did the trust thing with the public key that you received from your neighbor, that set up a digital certificate or tied to that digital certificate, and then it made it possible to verify that yes, you indeed received something on your end, and then the person that sent it can also verify the fact that you received it with a certificate. It says here that digital certificate makes it possible for Alice to verify Bob's claim that the key belongs to him. When Bob sends a message to Alice, he does not ask her to retrieve his public key from a central site. Instead, Bob attaches the digital certificate to the message. And the way we did it in our lab was that digital certificate actually had in it all of the trust that you set up with all the users on from the keys that you've received. So if I sent you a public key and everybody else in here sent you a public key, one of the steps of that lab that you did, remember, was creating a certificate, a revocation certificate. You guys had to save to your C drive, I believe. And it gave a time span of how long that should last. Again, from 1 year, 5 years, whatever. Every time you set up a trust, it's set up in that certificate, those trust relations with all those keys. one time. So here we have Bob creates the original email. Ralph intercepts that message, and I think I did that on the board that night. I brought up a Gmail account, opened up an encrypted email message in Gmail. Remember, just gave you all that gobbledygook because it wasn't decrypted. Had no key to decrypt it, no mechanism to decrypt it. And so here it says on number 3, Ralph replaces Bob's public key with his own. And then Alice retrieves Ralph's imposter public key. So a public key can be intercepted and possibly given a different key. The only way this would happen, though, is I think in the lab I had you guys do, I had you email each other the public key. There is a thing called public repository where you send your public keys and then the end users download them. There's no emailing back and forth. This is one where they would probably, it looks like it was probably sent via email, which would be less secure.
You send your public key and they download it?
Yeah, there's there's a lot of open source where you can have your own on your web server at work, where basically all of your public keys are stored in a public web server somewhere that you've created. And then the users that have your communication with you with that encryption would have to go to point their system to that web service to download the public keys that are needed. But now remember, in that public key creation, part of it is, and we could do this, in a private key creation before I go to public, I can actually put in a public key who the recipient's meant to be if I wanted to. That way only certain users could download it. Or even if users downloaded it that shouldn't download it, like the example before, they're not going to be able to do anything with it. It's not going to be able to be accepted. So a digital certificate will have these items, and we did this in the email lab. Your name, owner's name, a public key, the name of the issuer, the person that created the private key, the digital signature of the user, serial number of the digital certificate, an expiration date. There is what's called a certificate authority that is an entity that issues digital certificates. Any site you go on to purchase anything, Amazon, Best Buy, Sears, Walmart, or anything you purchase has a digital certificate for their purchasing of their website, the pages that they use for authentication.
The SSL, right?
Yeah, the SSL security. Well, that CA is actually, it costs money. They usually have it in increments of 2 years, 3 years, 5 year increments of how long you can have a certificate, and you can purchase it and it's generated. And banks have these. When you do any transactions on banks, they have digital certificates on those. And a lot of your web browsers now will actually see the authenticity of a certificate, and it'll tell you whether or not it is authentic. Now, an example would be this. If you ever go to, well, you guys don't use it here, but we do as faculty and staff here. We use Outlook OWA. It's Outlook Web Access is what it's called, where you access our web server via the web. Well, they've created in-house their own digital certificate. They didn't purchase it from a CA, and so every time you go to that, especially in Firefox will do this, even IE will do it too, but Firefox will say this certificate is not purchased from authority. It's not a verified certificate, and there's a number of them. VeriSign is the most popular one, probably out right now. So anyway, you have to bypass that and accept it. Yes, yes, yes. I want to keep going. But if you had a company that was selling something, or that's the best example I can give you, or a bank, institution, you would have to go out and buy your own, institute CA certificate. Valid. What they do is they validate that you are number one, a valid business. They usually clear that through the local Better Business Bureau. They do some background checking, and so it's not just like they let anybody purchase these. And so they make sure you're a valid company, that you are not, illegal, doing any legal activity of any type, before they give you that certificate of authority. Now, the user, it says here, provides information to the CA that verifies his or her identity. The user generates public and private key and sends those public keys to the CA. The user in this case would be, Dell, Apple, Gateway, Sears, Amazon. The CA inserts this public key into the certificate. And the next one is the registration authority. This handles some CA tasks, such as processing certificates, requests, and authenticating users. So these kind of go hand in hand. The certificate revocation list, in fact, when we did the email lab in here, this is one of the things that created was a revocation certificate, had you save it to the C drive. What this is, a CRL, it lists revoked certificates. In fact, you can actually look at your web history in Internet Explorer. It'll show you certificates that are stored locally on your PC or Mac. It'll also show you how long it has before that certificate expires, or if it's already expired. It can be accessed to check the certificate status of other users. Most CRLs can be viewed or downloaded directly, like I just mentioned, via the web browser. You can double click on it, and it'll look like a certificate in your directory, in your folder directory. It actually looks like a certificate before you double click on it. It looks kind of like this on your icon. Kind of looks like this, and it has a little certificate on the upper left corner, and it's a certificate. And actually, if you put your mouse over it, Windows and Mac both will say it's a type of certificate, is what it'll say as far as the type of file it is. The CR, the certificate repository, it's a publicly accessible directory that contains certificates and CRLs published by a CA like VeriSign. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go for it.
Thanks.
So VeriSign has a public entity where they store all their CAs, and Dell, Gateway, Microsoft, Amazon, all stores, all their CAs are being stored in this CR repository. And it says here they're often available to all users through the web browser interface. And generally, like when you go to buy something on the web, the certificate's in there. It pulls it down and checks it with this repository that it's a valid certificate, especially if it says it's bought and sold or sold by VeriSign. They'll validate that it's actually theirs, because there has been noted where folks have tried to thwart a certificate and hack it and recreate it to make it look like a valid certificate. This screenshot here just goes over some of the different items within the certificate. I'll go ahead and blow it up here so you can see it. Here's what it actually would look like on a web browser. It would bring up a list of certificates and when they were revoked, date and time. And this would just be for one certificate. When the certificate would be revoked, date and time. Last update, it says on here, is 2008. Next update, last update, July 2008. Next update, August 2008. So it looks like this has a month validation where it replenishes. They're paying month by month for theirs on this. Authorizing, storing, revoking digital certificates. In here, in a CR repository like VeriSign, when you set up your account, you can actually get a search screen to search for not only your certificate, but any other certificate that might be out there. So the types of digital certificates, first is digital certificates can be used for these purposes: to encrypt channels to provide secure communication, encrypt messages for secure internet email communication. We did this lab in here, the second one. Verify identity of clients and servers on the web. So after you log into your bank, it attaches to a certificate your username, your computer name, the time you logged in, some hash files of your username password, puts it into your certificate on your local browser, and it usually puts a timestamp of, like, say 5 to 10 minutes on that local certificate. So if you were to leave your computer and come back 10 minutes later, it's going to make you start that whole process over again for security purposes. And so certificates can also have, kind of like cookies on a web browser, a time stamp for a shelf life for how long it's supposed to live. And why do you think that's important for certificates to have a time stamp or shelf life of lifespan?
Exactly what you said. I mean, if you jump up and have to run to the bathroom, somebody sits down 5 minutes later.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really not, a lot of times you think it's a timeout issue and it's not really, it's a certificate issue. You might actually go to your screen and nothing's changed and you go to do something and it says, you have to put you back to the login screen or something. And what's happened is it's checking for every page, they call it in web development, every post back is looking for a valid certificate. And if it doesn't have a valid certificate, it puts you back to the login screen, would be an example. So verifying the source and integrity of assigned executable code. This is another example. Say you purchase software, or you download software illegally. Somebody downloads software illegally from the web and try to install it. If it doesn't have a valid certificate for that executable, a lot of times it can disallow you from running that application altogether once it's downloaded. And the certificate can only be gotten correctly if you have a key you type in, you type the key in that they've given you, then it downloads from their web service, their CA, a valid certificate onto your computer to where you can run that software. Okay? Windows uses this for, how many's recently had to set up Windows where you enter your Windows key for the operating system key? Anybody had to do that before? When you set up a brand new operating system, you have to enter in the ID that Windows gives you on the software that it gives you, whether you download it or borrow it in the store. Well, that certificate key is what we're talking about for executables. So certificates are also used for executables to determine whether or not software is valid and it's not pirated. Microsoft uses it, even Macs begin to use this in all their software now. The one OS that does not use this, as you can probably imagine, is Linux. Linux doesn't use this much because Linux is all open source. Now that doesn't mean though you don't have to purchase some Linux applications, because you do. And so there are businesses that create Linux software that are not free of charge. You have to pay for that. But the one thing that you're not going to find a lot of is certificates for executables in the Linux world. Next is categories of digital certificates. Personal, like we did here in the lab for the email. Or maybe you do personal development. Is there anybody here who develops any like web or Windows applications, or you've ever done that before? Web or Windows applications? Well, every time, this is what I do full time during the day, is create Windows application for a local firm, and we have to create, every time you fire up Visual Studio, which is the software package we use to create the applications, we have an encrypted key every time we have to grab. We have a private and a public. When we're in development, we always use our private key to develop. And you can't even get into the development without knowing where the key is, number one, and what the password is, number two. When we publish it for everybody to use within an organization, we use a public key for that so everybody can open it. But it still has a key attached to that executable and a certificate, but it's public. So every time we release a new version, it has with it a public key and an encrypted certificate every time. Software that's published, I've already mentioned that. Microsoft, well known for this. Another one, encryption. Private key, public keys are created. Set up trust, communication is then valid and ready to go. So this part here is really the only piece as a network security admin. If you're setting up encryption locally, would be a one-time setup on each machine. If you're doing an email encryption setup or email protocol setup using encryption. Once it's set up though, from client to server, done internally. Okay? Governmental facilities have had encryption on every machine, every PC, Mac, for years. They have high-level encryption. And a lot of financial institutions all have encryption on every transaction that they have on their desktop. regardless if it be sending a file from one desk to the other, it's encrypted and decrypted. There are systems, I think we used one, I believe, was it last week or the week before, where we did the hidden file, hidden partition encryption. That's also used a lot now within banking and financial facilities, because as soon as you add something to a folder that's encrypted, you take it out, it's decrypted to give it to somebody else, to give it to a customer, whatever the case may be. And so encryption is still, everything I read, every seminar I go to, encryption is still in the infancy stage of where it's going to be in 10 years. It'll be seamless. It's pretty seamless now, but it'll be seamless in everything that we do, pretty much. Well, an example would be Gmail. Your Gmail account, when you log in, that whole login process of any login screen that you currently use for whatever service, I'm just using Gmail as an example, is an encrypted process. Now, when you get into that Gmail account and you begin sending and receiving emails, that process, as far as sending and receiving emails, is using an open SMTP protocol, which is not encrypted. It's open text. That's why it's real easy to intercept non-encrypted email, which a lot of users still use, both business and personal. And from the lab we did a few weeks back, it's not real hard to set up an encrypted protocol within an environment. And you can use open source, you can use commercial products, but definitely recommend if it's a business that has any type of patents or any type of files that are very highly sensitive, encryption is definitely the way to go. And Exchange has some really good, free, open source encrypted protocols in it that it's included in its newest version that works real well. So that's encryption, private public key. On Thursday, remember, no class. You're going to be doing what? Research. You're like, yes, research. Yes, research. No, research. Yeah, research. All right, so.
Can I do it tomorrow? I think just didn't do Thursday.
Hey, if you want to do it tomorrow and not do Thursday, that'd be fine by me. That would be great. That would be great. If you have any questions, know before you leave about your research paper presentation, come see me before you leave. Remember, 2 weeks from tonight is when we begin our first presentation series. All right? And these will all be recorded, okay, up here. I'll have little clickers for you guys. You have it nicer. We'll have it nicer than I have it. Little clickers, everything will be recorded where you guys can watch it later over the campfire and critique yourself. I'm just kidding. All right, so we are done. If you have any questions, come see me before you leave. Otherwise, see everybody next Tuesday. Get a lot done in your research paper.